Now Baha.
Well, now is time for brief reminiscence. I don't think I need that.
They can't hear you. We're older than your students.
Well, I think that's needed for the recording, not for you to hear. I know that at least there are some people who are prepared to present. Who would like to go first? Yes. I'll bring this, you don't have to, well, if you want, sure, you can come to the front. Jim.
Thank you. I'm Jim Lawler. I was a faculty member here, taught in this room,
Yes, I remember that. That's
and retired last month. So Willy was good to me. When I arrived here on the faculty, I wasn't one of his students. I didn't have the pleasure of working with him, but he was very good to me. I was one of Wilmer Anderson's students. His name's been mentioned. And when you come in as an assistant professor, and that was me in 1980, it's kind of a daunting experience because you have this empty lab and you're trying to build up a program. The university and the physics department gave me a generous startup package, but still, it's an empty lab. And Willy was quite generous. He loaned me vacuum equipment and a diffusion pump. Now, why would we want a diffusion pump? Isn't that old fashioned? I mean, people today want turbo pumps. Well, we had an idea. I had an idea for a atom-ion beam source. And it was going to produce some dust. And turbo pumps do not like dust. So the lab got filled up partly with equipment that Willy lent us. And this atom-ion beam source that we were working on worked with the whole periodic table from hydrogen all the way through to the actinides. And so we were pretty excited about it, and we're using it even recently. Now, that was the point of it. It was a universal source. We weren't worried about a little dust because we weren't trying to send it into an accelerator. We were going to do laser spectroscopy off of atoms and ions in the beam. And I have to say that 40 plus years later, I still have Willy's diffusion pump.
Thank you. Well, next we're going to hear from Hans, but he will report on Pia's contribution. Pia. Suebo.
Okay.
Okay. Perfect.
This is VR form VR microphone. Oh, yes.
No, it's working. It's working.
Why do you have the better microphone? Okay, can you hear me now? Pia had a first career as a ballerina, professional ballet dancer. And then after a while, she got tired of it and decided to do something else. And she took up a physics study and became a PhD in nuclear physics, and eventually became a postdoc with the Pintex collaboration. I will tell you later today about the Pintex collaboration. That was a collaboration between Wisconsin, Indiana, and a number of other institutions. Pia is in Sweden now, and she has written to me and asked me to read a text she sent because she felt that she had some important comments to make about Willy and her interaction with him. So now I'm reading the words of Pia. Pia writes, the direct interactions I had with Willy Haeberli were mostly during the Pintex experimental run.
Actually, you should use this. That's easier.
Yeah, eventually it'll work. Thank you. That was the first sentence. He would come and stand by your side while you were sitting in front of the computer, writing in the logbook, or trying to figure out something in front of the electronics rack. Pia writes, he would pose a question with a slight smile. Perhaps it's a trick question, you would think, but then it turned out he was sincerely interested in your answer. And it would inevitably lead to another question and a little humming on his part. Somehow you were on your way to understand something a little more in depth. Thus Willy was one of those rare people who affected his fellow beings such that talking with him made you feel more intelligent and sometimes even wiser. And it was not just imagine, it was a fact of how we learn. One other effect that Willy had on his surroundings was shown by the encouragement to question and never take anything for granted that permeated the research at IUCF in general, Indiana University Cyclotron Facility, and Pintex in particular. By and by, I learned that the majority of faculty had either been a student or a postdoc with Willy, and my conclusion is that a sound research culture is one of Willy's legacies to us, and thus to me in second generation. Pia's words.
Thank you. Other comments? Reminiscences. Or perhaps I will add, oh, Tom, you're next, okay.
Pia's comment brings to mind an incident here in Wisconsin. I think it was in the mid-1990s when we came back for a meeting which Wilmer Anderson and Willy had organized here. The publication was in one of the annual reviews. Well, what came from the annual reviews, I think. But at the banquet, I remember being struck by the population of scientists in the room. And I stood up after the meal and I asked for a show of hands of people who had either studied with, done an experiment with, or been a student of Willy or Wilmer Anderson. And about 50% of the hands went up. And then I asked for how many of the people in the room had been students of that first generation, and another 30% of the hands went up. It was incredibly impressive how many people were in that room, and already at that time, what sort of second generation influence Willy and Wilmer had. I was amazed.
Thank you, Tom.
I can't remember who said it, but talking about writing a paper with Willy. And there were two things that I remember people saying, don't know who said it. One was that Willy took each word, took it off the page, looked at it, looked it over, put it back down, that's okay. And then would look at each sentence from the standpoint, how could this possibly be misconstrued? And I mean, to me, that was just his secret. I mean, he just could make sure there could be no way you could misconstrue what was being said.
Thank you. Anyone else? Steve?
Steve Vigdor. Just a couple of comments in passing on what Dave just mentioned. That was absolutely true, but it made writing papers with Willy utterly painful. You know, beyond belief, and that shouldn't be lost, you know, in the translation here. And then the comment that Pia made, that she began to understand that everybody she was working with at the Indiana University cyclotron facility had all been students or postdocs with Willy. That was not accidental. I mean, we built up a group there in nuclear physics, specifically trying to you know, to bring in people who had learned how to do experimental physics with Willy and learned how to think about experimental physics with Willy, and even learned how to write papers with Willy, as painful as that was.
Thank you.
Let me also say one thing. I'm a third generation Haeberlerian. And I just wanted to mention that such people even also exist, because when Tom talked about the second generation, there's a third generation. I worked with Hans Schiek in Cologne. So I was a PhD student under Hans Schiek, and he found out about a postdoctoral position that I applied successfully to work with Tom Clegg in Chapel Hill, and I stayed there for 4 years. And I was influenced by Willy Haeberli through this generational process. And I since, you know, work with a company, so it fizzled out, but the ionized source, we built a cesium colliding beam source that was shown here in an earlier talk. And that is still operational in Jülich, in the Kernforschungszentrum Jülich, as I understand. So the effects of Willy Haeberli are international in that sense too. There was a whole group of, I don't know, 10 students that went through their PhD theses that were influenced by this work in Cologne.
Thank you. Koopa.
I'm going to interrupt this lovely stream of compliments and say something really nasty that Willy used to say. Do you know how he called Bloomington, Indiana? Gloomington.
Well, you know. I actually have been to Bloomington, and it has 2 or 3 good restaurants. It's not so bad. Anything else? Anyone else who would like to comment? I know that you are, oh, Tom, perfect.
So I'd like to reiterate this business of writing papers with Willie. The first paper I ever wrote was on the development of the cesium beam for the source. And I had never written a paper at all of any kind. Boy, getting up through Willie was rough. I think I went through probably 10 versions. I come up with one and I give it to him and he'd have all these corrections and I go back and there was one time when I put the corrections in and then he didn't like it. And so then he made me go back and it turned out it was my original thing. So, but he just wanted the flow and he wanted the lack of ambiguity. And it was very, very difficult for a beginner like me to get that. But the next paper was easier.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'm David Coker from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I actually had good experiences writing papers with Willie, but I remember the last one we wrote, we actually got some critical comments from a referee that we were asked to do something about, and Willie was shocked at the audacity of this person to question the words that he had put on the piece of paper.
I just have a short comment from the letters I've read, and that is, I think probably the first paper he wrote in collaboration with someone in Basel. I don't think it was Huber, it was a different professor, but he went on vacation with this professor's family to the Tessin in southern Switzerland and went camping, and they spent a week or two writing this paper on the family vacation.
Thank you. Well, I know that you are all eager to get to lunch, but let me just share you one more thing before we break off, if there is no one else would like to comment. I often heard that Willie and Gabi met in the street for the first time. Well, it turns out it's true, but there is a background to that story. They both went to listen to a jazz concert in some jazz club, but they ran out of tickets. So they were in front of the jazz club in the street, trying to figure out what to do because they couldn't get in. That's how they actually met. And when I first came to Madison in 1986, Willie and Gabi were actually living together, but they were not married yet. There were some conservative members of the department who thought that that was not a good thing to do. But they were actually happy because Gabi's last name was Haberland. So when Willie introduced her, they heard Haeberli. So they thought they were actually married long before they got married. So that was something that they were happy about. Are there any other comments? Pupa.
Yeah, actually, Willie proposed to Gabi 3 times before she finally said yes. She didn't want to get married. And one of these times was particularly romantic because they were in a fantastic hotel in southern France and he got on his knees. He had a red rose between his teeth and he was proposing to her. And this is the second time. And she said no. But finally, when she needed a green card to remain in this country, she said yes. That's when they got married.
Well, that shows that Gabi was a very, very reasonable woman, hesitated before she married a physicist. Any other comments? Well, I guess if not, the lunch is almost ready. I know that everyone is hungry, so we can break here and I'll see you at 2 o'clock in the afternoon after lunch.